What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Indiana Jones and the Great Circle via some first impressions, as technically the game isn't releasing for a few more days, but if you bought a certain edition of it, you get a few days early access, so that review embargo dropped yesterday, though I personally bought the game, which is how I'm bringing you this footage. I enjoyed what I had seen of the previews, and it looked pretty fun, and thus here we are. So first impressions wise, straight away, I would call this surprisingly good. Now, honestly, I expected a pretty run-of-the-mill action adventure, but this feels great to play. The cutscenes, the mechanics, the way it switches from first person to third person at opportune moments, it has thus far been a ton of fun, honestly. More so than I was expecting going into it. But let's dive in and talk specifics. So starting with how this thing is running, obviously we're a little ahead of its official release. And for the most part, it seems pretty good. I've had a few content creator specific problems. That is to say, this game doesn't seem to like my recording software. And I had to mess with some settings to get those recordings actually looking good enough to show. For instance, I had to re-record basically the entire intro of the game because that footage, for whatever reason, came out super washed out. But otherwise, it seems to be running pretty well, but I have a very high-end PC, the specs of which are in the channel's About section if you're curious. But I suppose we'll ultimately see when the general public gets their hands on it. But on to the more interesting stuff. So, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle puts us, of course, in the role of Indiana Jones, but specifically this takes place between the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Last Crusade, which makes the year 1937, with things getting kicked off after a dream sequence, where Indy wakes up only to find Marshall College being burglarized, and ourselves assaulted in the aftermath. Now, we follow some clues out to the Vatican, which ultimately leads to the theory of the Great Circle, which is like an internet theory from way back when, but has just enough veneer of believability to come across as something really interesting, which I would say is good enough for a game like this. Now, once those introductions are out of the way, you actually get to explore some large explorable zones that almost feel like a combination of like Dishonored and Hitman, which I thought was interesting. Because truth be told, I was honestly expecting something a little more linear, but it would seem you're basically dropped into like these large explorable maps, and you'll be able to pick up things like side quests, do side activities, explore around, all while trying to pursue the primary investigation. Now, both the exploration and the combat and things can be adjusted via difficulty, so if you don't want to deal with a lot of the puzzles, you can turn like the puzzle difficulty down specifically, which simplifies a bunch of them, which I thought was kind of neat, and that's separate from the combat difficulty, which determines how difficult it is to actually take on the various enemies, which means you might be more inclined for stealth on those higher difficulties. Though speaking of, I would say in a somewhat similar vein to Dishonored, really, the game doesn't really put any restrictions on how you approach things outside of, can you pull it off? For instance, you can very much so go in guns blazing, but it doesn't exactly feel great as compared to actually utilizing the rest of your skills and whatnot. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they really nailed how the whip feels, so it can be used both in combat as well as exploration. In combat, you can use it to disarm enemies. Outside of combat, you'll use it in traversal as basically a rope, as you would probably expect, but you can also use it here and there in unexpected places, so that's been fun. But progression-wise, I was pretty curious how they would handle this, and from the looks of it, as you explore and stuff, you'll find all sorts of notes and little things to help your investigations or just little novelties, and each of these contributes to your adventure points, as it calls them. And then also along the way, you'll find various books. These books can teach you certain abilities at the cost of those adventure points, which will make things like combat easier via giving you more stamina, making traversal easier, that kind of thing. Now, what really surprised me a little bit, though, was how much they kind of leaned into disguises and whatnot. So the first place you go, the Vatican, you'll wind up getting a couple different outfits there to put on so you blend into various places more or less a bit easier, opening up some avenues for exploration. You'll also eventually get access to a camera to take pictures, which can help you out with those adventure points. And those shops will usually also give you leads to find, things like the side quests and anything else that might be interesting in the area. So all in all, putting some of that together for a proper first impressions here, I would say that thus far I have been pleasantly surprised. I went into this expecting, a decent action adventure, and so far it's been a lot better than decent. And as I move to review this one, much of what I have on my own mind is simply, will the combat and like the, say, tense moments around whether or not to engage in combat and all the little micro decisions that go into a situation like that, if that manages to be compelling across the entire game, or if any of this is going to get stale like halfway through. Another thing I'll be curious about is the puzzles and investigations and how the difficulty affects things like those and how approachable this will be as a result, but ultimately we shall see. Early on here though, I'm having a lot of fun with it, and hopefully the review shouldn't take too long, though given this is an action adventure, those games usually aren't too time intensive, but we'll simply have to see what happens. This should be my next up review though, so you shouldn't have to wait too long one way or the other. So if you're looking forward to that review, or you just like this video, by all means certainly subscribe and stick around, maybe leave a comment while you're at it, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.